Hey everybody, so I'm in the ABC 10 newsroom, and today we got the official word from CAL FIRE. They say that PG&E was in fact the root cause of the 2018 Camp Fire, the deadliest wildfire in state history. I'm working on a big project about this. We're going to have an upcoming series about California's wildfire crisis and how it is complicating the ability for California to simply have electricity, to keep the lights on for millions and millions of people. Ask me anything about this crisis, because this is what my life has been about for the last several months, and the next several months will be about. But this does confirm our reporting from 2 weeks ago. We talked to DA Mike Ramsey up in Butte County, who confirmed to us then that investigators had in fact determined PG&E equipment was the cause of the Camp Fire. PG&E came out and said as much in February. They told us that they believed that their equipment would ultimately be found responsible. They had to make that disclosure to investors because they're a publicly traded company, so they had to file a form with the SEC. And then, of course, we learned a little bit more when the company filed for bankruptcy, which I think there's a lot of confusion about that as well. PG&E filed for bankruptcy does not mean that the company is going out of business. In fact, it's the exact opposite of that. The company filed for bankruptcy because it expects to have to pay out tens of billions of dollars in damage due to these wildfires, both in 2018 and 2017. And it's really kind of mind-bending to think about, because now you have the state of California saying that our biggest power company is responsible for fires that killed a total of 107 people in just 2 years. There were 22 wildfires in 2017 that were blamed on PG&E by CAL FIRE. This adds the Camp Fire, which killed 85 people, to that list. It talks about the origin point being near the town of Pulga, which really is, it's less of a town and more of a resort, but there's a high tension power line that runs right down a canyon about 8 miles or so away from the town of Paradise, and that is where this fire is believed to have started. PG&E says that it has a hook on that line, a big metal hook that was holding up part of it that appears to have failed. It was worn down, and it's believed that that allowed a high-tension power line to swing free from the big steel tower it was on, make contact with the tower, and then shower the ground in molten metal. That just happened to happen on a morning where we had incredibly dry and fast wind blowing right toward Paradise, so you did have this sort of perfect storm that day that led this fire to burn up the top of a hill, spread out miles wide, and then shower the town of Paradise in embers all at once. And that's why the fire was so overwhelming for the responders working on it. Tracy says PG&E is trying to shirk its responsibility for the disasters it caused again, break it up. Breaking up PG&E is in fact something the state is openly contemplating, Tracy. The PUC, Public Utilities Commission, has said as much. They've talked about possibly simply taking away the franchise from PG&E, which sounds simple, I guess, but it isn't. PG&E owns tens of billions of dollars in power lines, so taking it requires eminent domain, which means we have to come up with the tens of billions of dollars to buy all that stuff away from them. Breaking them into smaller companies doesn't come with that expense necessarily. If you allow them to stay a private company, you could break them into smaller regions, for instance, or you could simply say, you know what, you can't be a power and gas company anymore. You have to do one or the other and break them into two. So there are some theories out there about how PG&E might be broken into smaller entities, because there's kind of two knocks on PG&E that ring a bit true here, that they're too big to fail, meaning that 16 million people get electricity from them and no one wants the lights to stop coming on. But then they're also too big to succeed is the other knock that you hear about PG&E, that they're out of touch with this massive geographic area. PG&E, I think a lot of people don't realize, it's the size of Oklahoma, and if you made it a state, by population, it would be the 5th largest in the country, right after New York. That's how big of a monopoly we're talking about with PG&E. So when you talk about breaking it up, there are some facts behind that, and it sort of sheds some light on why that is a solution that some people are looking to. So thanks, Tracy, for the comment. Elena, you're asking, can the people in charge be sent to jail for starting the fire? Not yet. So PG&E is right now a convicted federal felon. They were convicted of 6 felonies out of the 2010 San Bruno gas explosion, 5 counts of willfully breaking safety laws that the federal government has for gas pipeline operators, and then one count of obstructing justice for misleading the investigators. No one went behind bars for that, and that's because PG&E was charged as a corporation. None of the people working for it were named in those charges, and the judge in the case, since the company has now since violated its probation, simply came out and said a corporation cannot go to prison. So he's had a struggle trying to sort of punish the company for this latest violation of probation. Milici, no one is willing to take the responsibility of what the company does. Hold on. California can't afford it, and no one wants to deal with the wildfire responsibility if they do take over. Well, that really does hint at the crux of the problem. We were talking about the proposed solution of breaking PG&E into smaller companies, but the question is, who wants to take it over, especially since the equipment that PG&E owns right now on the ground has started so many fires. You have, again, now CAL FIRE is saying this company started fires in just 2 years that killed 107 people. Who wants to take that over and be on the hook if it starts another fire or if there's another gas pipeline explosion like in San Bruno? So it isn't as simple as just finding someone else to do it. You got to find someone who's willing to take on that responsibility, knowing full well that there's a dangerous situation potentially on the ground that they would be inheriting. And you followed up asking, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Milici, that no offers have been made to purchase the company. We haven't seen one. We have seen some reporting. There's been some good reporting by NPR in recent months about the possibility of the company selling off its gas division to pay for the tens of billions of dollars in wildfire damage, which is an interesting idea. That would essentially shuffle that cost onto a new set of investors. If you could find some, it's not at all clear that we would be able to find someone willing to take on running everything that this company owns, given the track record that it has and the history that it has. One interesting detail before I get to some more of your questions, and please do continue asking them, I'll just continue to scroll down those. One little nugget of new information that we had out of this CAL FIRE release, there was some discussion, you may recall, early on after the Camp Fire last year about a possible second location, a second start to this fire. CAL FIRE confirmed that did happen. It was near the town of Concow, and that was on a distribution line. So they're saying the main start was on a transmission line. These are those big steel towers that you see. Transmission lines carry power, high voltages across huge distances, so they connect regions. There's a second start that was on a distribution line, and that you got to think more about like the wooden poles you see driving all around town, in your neighborhood. They distribute the power to where you are. There was a second start, they say, but that second start in Concow was consumed by the original fire, the one that was started by those high tension power lines, which, by the way, is where the very first firefighters responded the morning of November 8th last year, before all of Paradise burned down in one day. Tracy is saying their plan to shut power off during high winds will also shut off rural areas' water supplies for those of us who rely on wells. Are they responsible for the mass cancellation of thousands of homeowners insurance policies? So two different things to take a bite at there, Tracy. The shutoffs are going to expand this summer. There's no two ways about that. You will see more power shutoffs. They will not be convenient. The average shutoff, according to state regulators, lasts 3 days. And you're going, why is that? Well, they can't just shut it off and turn it right back on. The whole point of shutting it off is to protect the system from damage that might happen in high wind. And in order to make sure that you did that right, you have to go back and inspect the entire power line before you turn it back on. And that's really what's responsible for those delays in getting the power going again. And depending on how big of an area of the power grid they have to shut off, it can take a really long time to either fly down the line and make sure no trees fell on it or no part of it fell on the ground, or get people out on foot or in vehicles to do that. So it's not as simple as just flicking the power on and then waiting for the wind to die, or flicking it off, and then waiting for the wind to die and flicking it back on. There's a lot more steps that have to go on there. One reason the power wasn't shut off to the power line that the state now says started the Camp Fire is it was one of those big transmission lines, and PG&E never made plans to shut those off, just the distribution lines, the smaller power lines in neighborhoods, which are responsible for most of the fires started by the power grid. It's actually rather unusual what CAL FIRE is saying here, because those distribution lines are above the trees typically, so they don't have to worry about branches blowing into them. Again, that is not what PG&E has hinted happened. PG&E has said that a hook failed in the high wind that day. And then Tracy, you also raised cancellation of homeowners insurance policies? No, they are not going to be held responsible for the actions of some third-party company deciding not to sell you insurance. But it is, the net effect of that is a lot of people are going to pay a lot more for insurance, particularly if you live up in the wildland. But even if you don't, your bill for your homeowner insurance in urban LA or here in Sacramento is likely to go up about 5-10% in the long run because of these wildfires. But if you live up in the woods, yeah, your bill might be going up, by a factor of 2. You may get kicked off, as you say, and in that case, you're looking at sort of the state's backup plan as your only option, which costs more and doesn't provide quite as much insurance. So it is a serious issue that you raise when it comes to insurance and trying to get people coverage, given what's going on with these wildfires. Chelsea is asking about how this might affect ratepayers. We're all going to pay more. That's one of the things I'm going to really try to drive home in this series that we're working on here at ABC 10. Everyone is going to pay more because of this wildfire crisis, and not all of it is the fault of PG&E. Even though the campfire is being blamed on PG&E equipment right here, you have to remember this is all happening in the context of what's going on in California's forests. And depending on which political leader you listen to, you're hearing, oh, this is a climate change problem, or you're hearing this is a forest management problem and we have to do better on the ground. The truth is it's really both. For 100 years, California has put out every wildfire we could because we figured that was the best thing to do. And the result of that is we now have a landscape problem where there's 100 years worth of bonfire that's been building up out in our forests because natural fires weren't able to come in and clean it up. We stopped that from happening. You put that against the backdrop of climate change and global warming, and now we have temperatures that are rising in California and a big pile of fuel out in the forest at the same time, and that is leading to some of this extreme fire behavior. You need only look a few months before the campfire to see an example with that giant fire tornado, the EF3 tornado that hit Redding, California in the middle of a wildfire. That wasn't started by a utility, but that's an example, an extreme example, by the way, of something that can happen these days that we just have not seen before. Tracy saying she received notice her plan won't be renewed after 29 years. You are not alone, Tracy. This is happening to a lot of people up there. And it's sort of, it really hints at a bigger issue than just insurance. If you look at Paradise, a lot of the people who lived in Paradise moved there to get away from the high cost of living down in the urban centers of California. So you might have been, I've met people who lived there who were pushed out essentially by the price of housing in the Bay Area, decided, you know what, I'm going to move up to those pretty trees up there. Well, a lot of people have done that. And it's not just Paradise. There are hundreds of Paradises in California, and those people are in for a rude awakening. When you start having an insurance bill, if you're lucky enough to be able to get coverage that is comparable in price to your mortgage statement, that becomes a really tough situation for people who are just trying to move to get a better cost of living. And so the housing crisis in California is now being exacerbated by the wildfire crisis in California. Everything is connected. Mary Elise saying PG&E wants to raise rates to pay for their mistake. They want to satisfy shareholders at our expense. We want better service, better safety measures. What's the answer? Maybe public utilities shouldn't be publicly traded so shareholders are taken out of the loop. Well, you're hinting at yet another thing, Mary Elise, that the state has hinted, which is the idea of privatizing or rather taking over basically PG&E and turning it into 100 or 1,000 SMUDs. Again, that's possible. The state has it within its power to do that, but that means buying PG&E out of the equipment that it owns. So that's what makes it such a sticky thing to try to change the business model. You can't just take things away from PG&E, no matter how badly they may have behaved in people's eyes. There's still a concept of eminent domain that requires fair market value to be paid. So likely what would happen if the state did decide it wanted to play that card is a long court battle over what the cost of all of PG&E's stuff is worth and how much the state owes them and their investors for taking it all away. As a practical matter, I can tell you I've interviewed the head of the PUC and he's telling me there's just no appetite to do that. So while it is sort of the big stick that the state has as a threat hanging over PG&E's head, it's not going to happen. And the reason why is the price tag that I just described. You're talking about $70 billion. That's comparable money to what the entire state budget is. So it's not as simple as just being able to take them over. What is the answer is really the $30 billion question, right? So the state has struggled, courts have struggled, and regulators have struggled to get PG&E to turn the ship around. And that's despite billions of dollars in fines. That's despite them being on probation and having a federal court monitor who's embedded within the company right now and maybe for a total of 5 years. So trying to find an answer to steer this company in a safer direction has really long eluded all of the people in all the branches of government who have been working on this crisis, and a lot of them are pounding their head into the wall. One thing that they will point to, the leaders of the state, that is positive, is at least the company has appointed new board members. Up until this year, half of the members of PG&E's board were serving on the board back in 2010 when the company blew up a whole neighborhood in San Bruno, killed 8 people, and then earned 6 felony convictions for doing so. So just to give you a taste of how slow that company can be to change, at least now there's a new majority board. Let's see. Felicia is saying Brown and Newsom are out of the responsibility for the fire, even though they voted against clearing fire hazard brush. You're going to have to be a little more specific about what you mean by that, Felicia, because governors don't vote on legislation. They can veto it. So perhaps you're talking about their spending priorities and a budget. Regardless, one of the sticky things about this is certainly in the Camp Fire, a lot of this was private land that burned, and that would be subject, that is what we call the state responsibility area. Now, the state doesn't own that land, so it's not really the state's job to clean it up. It's the landowner's job to clean it up. The state has been incentivizing people to do that work and paying more crews to go out and do it as well. But then a lot of the wildfires we have are actually on federal land, and there's roughly a 50-50 split. The general take from fire scientists is we need to clean up, I should say, about 1 million acres of forest a year in California, with about half of that being in the state responsibility and about half of that being in the Forest Service and federal land responsibility. And both of them have been ramping up, but they're not quite to that 1 million acres a year target, which is what they basically say Mother Nature used to clean up on its own with wildfires before we started putting them all out. Mary Elise suggesting that maybe if CEOs were held personally responsible for a big mistake like a fire, they would make better decisions. Yes, one of the sticky things about that, though, Mary Elise, is that in court, they've got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that person X who is accused is actually guilty of it. They got to get a whole jury to say, yes, Bob Smith did this, and that's tough. One of the things that you learn when you talk to the people prosecuting these things is, while it's frustrating for a lot of us to look at this and go, hey, how come no one ends up behind bars? At least being able to prosecute the company gives them a way to hold some entity accountable for this. Given that you can have a bunch of different employees of the company all pointing the finger at each other and saying, well, that wasn't my part of the store. Maybe it wasn't just one person that caused the chain of events that led to a fire like this. Perhaps it was several, and no one of them did anything criminal, but the company did something criminal in the totality of the picture, and there is a mechanism to go after that. Right now, we're not to that step in the investigation. Talked to the DA in Butte County a couple of weeks ago, and he said they haven't even concluded whether a crime occurred, but he did openly discuss the possibility of manslaughter charges, saying that if they do find enough evidence that the mindset or culture of PG&E was such that they deliberately avoided maintenance in an area, knowing full well that people could be hurt by that decision, there might be a way to go after them for 85 counts of manslaughter for the 85 people who died in the Camp Fire. And again, if you're just joining us, this now makes, with CAL FIRE's determination today that PG&E equipment started this fire, now we have the state saying that PG&E fires killed 107 people in just 2 years. That counts 22 fires that the state has blamed on PG&E equipment in the wine country fires in 2017. Richard Wilson says PG&E is at fault, period. Well, that's basically what's being said here. The question is, what was the nature of that, right? Was it just their equipment started this, but they maintained it all the way they should have? Or was it their equipment started this and they deliberately avoided maintaining it, in which case you might be talking about criminal charges, so stay tuned for that. There isn't an exact timetable on this. I would expect probably months away from learning whether there's going to be any criminal charges against PG&E or anyone who works in it. DA wouldn't rule that out either, saying that if they find that sort of, for lack of a better term, smoking gun against an executive at PG&E, they're not going to be bashful about naming them. And that's really going to be the key thing to pay attention to the day we learn this news, whether there are criminal charges. If there are, you're going to want to look and see if there's a human being named in those charges, not just PG&E. Because if it's just PG&E, we already know what the end of that movie looks like. They're going through it in federal court right now. They've been on probation. They've violated the probation. All the judge can really do is give them more probation, because you can't throw them behind bars. Charge the CEOs with murder. Interesting, Mary, that you raised that question, because the state AG was asked by the federal court what kind of trouble could PG&E be in if there was a crime in starting the campfire. So this is a hypothetical back when the court was looking at how to deal with their violation of probation, and murder was one of the theories. Now, that's not likely to happen. You'd have to really prove some pretty bad stuff happened and have it in black and white. We're talking like an email saying like, "No, Joe Bob, Inspector, don't you dare fix that power line. I don't care if you kill people. I don't care that you're telling me that," that sort of thing. Without that level of evidence, I don't think that murder is even realistically on the table, even though it's a potential charge out there. But you do have the DA in Butte County openly discussing the possibility of manslaughter charges, which is interesting. It's not the kind of thing you're used to hearing when it comes to a big corporation being investigated for potential crimes. Anthony's saying they will pay out, then the customers will pay on their bill. Same thing happened in the Bay Area. Unfortunately, PG&E is protected because it's a monopoly. They are a monopoly, Anthony. It's a legal monopoly, and it never expires. I think that's a big misconception that a lot of people have, too, is why doesn't the state just non-renew them? You can't non-renew them. There's a big egghead reason why that is, but it all boils down to something called the Wisconsin model. So way back in the day, you used to have, it was called the New York model, they used to put an expiration date on a monopoly, and that way they could simply change power companies. But what they found was during the last year of the contract, the company wouldn't put any money back into its system, and they didn't like that. So the idea was, if you just give them a monopoly forever and say, you just run it real good or we'll take it away from you, the idea was that would incentivize companies to do better. Obviously, that hasn't seemed to have worked out for PG&E, and that's why the state is looking at all kinds of new potential remedies to deal with that, including breaking the company up, including yanking their monopoly away from them, which again would be an expensive option and is very unlikely to happen. But at the end of the day, there's going to be some sort of regulatory action against this company. The question is, what does that look like? And then as it comes to the investigation of the campfire, are there going to be criminal charges is sort of the next question here. You were also asking about customers paying on their bill, Anthony. And as of right this moment, PG&E does not have permission to pass along the costs of the campfire, even though the state is now saying they started it. They do have that permission for the fires in 2017. There were 22 fires that CAL FIRE blames on PG&E from those wine country fires in 2017, killed a total of 22 people, those 17 fires did. And right now, PG&E has the authority to take out a big bond, basically, kind of like you or I would take out a mortgage, use that money to pay those victims, and then pass along the payments for those bonds to everyone on their bills. And if you are a PG&E customer, you are going to pay more than most for this. But that being said, everyone's going to pay more in their power bill, whether you're in PG&E or country or not. SMUD is paying double for their insurance right now, or more, I believe. I want to say they said that their premiums for raising their insurance coverage by something like 50% went up double. So it's they're seeing this cost now, and the insurance market that these utilities go to cover themselves from damage from fires they might cause, that's going to go away. That's some testimony we heard at the State Wildfire Commission. So not only could they not buy enough insurance anyway to cover a fire the size of the campfire, they won't be able to buy insurance at all pretty soon, because that insurance market is seeing that these fires are routinely $5, $10, $15 billion a piece. And if that happens, that burns through the $1.5 billion maximum that they could get insurance for anyway. And what insurance company wants to take that kind of loss every year? So that market is collapsing on itself. The state is talking about setting up a fund to basically insure these utilities instead so that the lights can come on. So while we do have this sort of, on one hand, we've got this giant tragedy, really. I mean, when you take the campfire with its 85, fatalities, and then you've got, the 22 people that died in fires the state blames on PG&E the year before, before, there's obviously, you know, a need to take care of those communities for the damage that they've suffered. The town of Paradise is not going to exist like it used to. I mean, they're going to be out of commission for years. They don't have drinkable water. It's going to take until early 2020 to clean up just the debris that's lying around Paradise, the burned out houses. So that community is not coming back the way it was. A lot of those people aren't willing to wait the couple of years living in temporary digs while they build a new house. And so when that town comes back, it'll be a new town. It'll be a different town than it ever used to be. So not only has this taken a lot of lives, it's killed a community. Really and truly it has. And trying to make up for that, you know, you can put a dollar amount on this, but there is some level of this that you just literally are never going to be able to compensate for. Megan saying, as a campfire survivor who lost everything, this isn't the employee's fault. However, it's the fault of the executives and the board. Megan, first of all, I'm really sorry that you had to run from that fire that day. I was up there while Paradise was burning all around me, and you know, it's one of those things that you just don't shake images like that. It was night during the day, so my thoughts go out to you and everyone who lost a house. It's the fault of the executives and the board, you say? I mean, there are definitely a lot of lawyers for victims that are arguing that very same thing. They've changed a lot of executives and the board lately. And so at some point, you know, you've got the state arguing, well, they've got to be given a chance to do their job. The governor argued as much recently at a press conference he held about this. And while I think that's true, obviously, if you're brand new to this company, you deserve a chance to try to right the ship. You raise that tough question about, you know, fault, right? Who's to blame, and can you hold them personally responsible? And to this date, that's just not been the case. We've seen the company held responsible as a company, and you've got that, you know, old political debate. You know, you can think back to the Romney campaign and his little gaffe about corporations are people. They're not. You can't throw a corporation in prison. The judge in the case against PG&E says as much. He's struggled to find ways to punish this company for, you know, being a bad offender. They violated their probation. They're on probation, violate it, and, you know, it's questionable whether he can even add years to the probation. 5 years is supposed to be the max, and ultimately he decided not to try because that probably would have led to an appeal. Or I'm speculating. He didn't say that that's why he didn't do it, but that was something the prosecutors pointed out in that case. It's really a struggle to try to hold the company accountable for starting these fires, regardless of what the evidence shows. Could that start to change? Talking to the prosecutors out in Butte County, they're looking for it, is what they'll tell you. But again, if and when they do decide that there was a crime here, which hasn't been determined yet, but if they do, that's going to be the big thing to look for. Is a human being named in those charges? Because if a human being's not named in those charges, nobody's going to jail. So thanks for your comment. I appreciate it. Anthony. Anthony was just responding to you, Megan. I think a lot of us, you know, our hearts really go out to the people who've been displaced by this fire. It's really, as I wrap up here, and feel free to ask anything in the meantime, if you look at what's happened to Chico, it was only a couple of weeks ago, I believe the same day we interviewed the DA, that the state finance department came out and said that Chico grew by 20%, which, you know, it's not quite this simple, but it almost means, you know, 1 in 5 people down in Chico are displaced by a fire. And that's had a crazy effect on that town. I mean, real estate's through the roof. The DA was telling me after our interview that they've had trouble recruiting job candidates to come up and move there because they're looking at the price of housing and it's gone sky high because there's nothing on the market. So this really does have ripple effects throughout that entire region, but it will throughout the entire state too. We're all going to pay more for electricity. We're all going to pay more for our insurance. There may be taxes and fees on top of it to pay for the fact that we can't get insurance for our power companies in California anymore because these fires keep happening. So a lot of bills are going to come due at the same time. And not just those things. There's also the cost of trying to buy down the danger, which is its own deal. You know, you got 20, 30 million acres of forest that need treating out there. It's $500 to $2,000 an acre, rough justice, to treat it and try to make it not burn the way these fires have been burning. How are we going to pay for that at the same time that everyone's cost of living is going up for these fires? So it is really one of those things where all of us are going to pay, and the more we pay attention right now, the more sway that our voices are going to have over what that looks like in the future. So if you have more questions, by all means, jump down in the comments. I'll peruse this a little bit later, and I'll be on and off of here as more developments come out. And look for our project on California's wildfire crisis. We're hoping to have that coming a little more than a month from now, a month and a half, maybe 2. So we will make a lot of noise when that happens. Thanks so much for watching this. Oh, Tracy, you got one more? Instead of more or bigger fines, mandate that power lines be put underground. Tracy, it costs about 10 times as much to put a power line underground. You know, you might be looking at millions of dollars per mile, and so that's really the struggle. And that it's easier to do some places than others. If you look up in the forest where a lot of this is happening, you're talking about undergrounding in granite. That's really tough to do. So it's not even necessarily feasible everywhere. But what I will tell you is that the federal judge that's dealing with their probation has ordered more surprise inspections. They're going to be looking for how far away from the power lines the trees are. And then the company itself is already proposing system hardening measures, which include spraying retardant in advance on the ground. So that red, fire retardant that you see dropping out of the airplane, treating the ground right beneath the power lines with that so the fire doesn't get off and running as quickly. That's just one example. They're also insulating lines. So a lot of the power lines you see out there in the world are just bare metal lines sitting out there, and it makes it easier for it to start a fire in theory. The idea is if you insulate it, put some protective coating around that, then potentially you can buy down some of the danger if the line was to make contact with a tree or whatever. You're talking about the retardant being toxic. I don't believe that's the case, but let's get on Phos-Chek's website and just real quick. I'm gonna look for you. I used to know, I want to say there's like a component of it that's fertilizer, which is kind of interesting because you're spraying it to try to get rid of the danger, and so you don't want stuff to grow again. Here we go. Wildland. All right, I'm gonna have to look at the data sheets on that. You know what? I'm gonna follow up with you though real quick after we wrap up the video, because I don't think people want to sit here and look at me looking at websites. But thanks for the comments, I appreciate it. If you got more questions, by all means, jump down in the comments and I will answer as many of them as I can. And thanks so much for watching. Appreciate it. Bye.